On today's podcast, I have Dr. Saira with me. She is a counselor, a teacher, a podcaster, TED Talk speaker, and a storyteller. Welcome, Dr. Saira, and thank you so much for coming on my podcast. You are an individual that wears many different hats. I think the honor is mine to have you on my show. Can you share a little bit about what mental health means to you?
Sure. So I think mental health, for me, there's all these technical definitions, and you being a therapist is all you know that we have these kind of scientific definitions of what is mental health. But I think for me personally, mental health is more about peacefulness, a sense of like inner calm and steadiness, and that we're able to maintain that no matter what's kind of going on around us. That would be kind of the simplest way. And that's the way I actually explain it to my kids, right? That it's that sense of peace and that sense of steadiness, and that we're able to keep that no matter, what life is throwing at us.
Mm-hmm. And that is so important. And I think not a lot of people realize that it is about kind of keeping that peace. And has this definition or idea of mental health changed throughout the years for you?
I would say yes. When I was younger, when I thought about mental health, for me that was about my social life and like my seeing people, and now, like, while social support is important, it's less important in my teens and 20s, right? In the last couple of years, I have had a depressive episode, and become I actually have to work at staying well. It's not just something that's going to happen. And I think that's what's really changed over the years, is seeing my mental health as something that I have to constantly be supporting, just like physical health, right? Like, we go to the gym, eat right, we do all things to keep health maintained. I realize that you have to do that with your mental health as well. And which is weird, because I think that I would know that, but when I didn't do that for myself. And over the last couple of years, I've really built in kind of systems into my life to kind of keep steady and to keep well, because life throws all kinds of things at us, and it can be really easy to slip into that state and not even really know you're there until it's almost too late.
Mm-hmm. That's so true. So what does that look like? How do you keep working at it on a day-to-day basis?
So there's different things. So one of them, let's see, where do I even start? So to be honest, is around like diet, exercise, and sleep, like the basics, right? Because when my body's feeling good, I'm likely to feel good from a mental health perspective. And we know that like certain foods are triggering, like caffeine, for example. I have caffeine because I know that it's an anxiety trigger. I try to eat lots of leafy vegetables because I know that's good for my brain. I try to stay like moving because I know that's good for me overall, which is a little bit hard right now as the weather changes. But just those kinds of basic foundational things. And on top of that, the more subtle things, like making sure, for example, that I have kind of peaceful pockets throughout my home. So I have the place where I work, and then I have the place where I rest, and it's really delineated. Like, I don't bring work home, and that's something new for me over the last few years. My bedroom is like really peaceful. Like, I don't really have much stuff in there. I have very like warm, like simple, not much going on in there, so that I'm at the end of the day, it's easy for me to wind down. I'm not kind of like looking around at the mess. Other things, and this is like the main thing for me right now, is I've moved, and so I'm away from my loved ones and those who are close to me. And so for me, it's about keeping in touch with those people who just keep me, and making sure that I have like regular contact with them. And the last thing for me, it might sound strange, but it's actually volunteering, like giving back to the community in different ways. So I run different online groups. I do like kind of this like ad hoc consulting for people in my community that need mental health support. So that kind of give back, it makes me feel like that sense of purpose. And so I see those combinations of like my lived environment, my social group and support, and then giving back. Those are the things that the day-to-day things that I have to do. Plus plus I take vitamins and also like the omega-3s and whatever they say is like supposed to be good for your brain, that stuff as well.
Mhm. So if someone were to kind of start their own mental health journey in trying to maintain or start a sense of peace in their life, what would you recommend as a first step?
Well, I think ultimately mental health, feeling mentally well, has a lot to do with being okay in your own company, right? So for me as an extrovert, it felt great when I'm around other people, but it took me time to feel good on my own. And so I think for somebody starting out who might be an extrovert, I would say to like stop looking outside and start actually spending some time on the inside. So whether that's through journaling, whether that's through just like walking outside and reflecting on your life, becoming aware that we have a rich inner life. I think that would be the starting point. I think for like generally speaking, introverts just do that because they do enjoy spending time with themselves, so they do kind of reflect and look inward. I think for a lot of extroverts, it's easy to get swept up, right, in everything around us, and sometimes hard to kind of still ourselves. So I would say that would be it, like putting value on being alone. That would be a place to start.
Yes, and I've heard many people who struggle with just that idea of being by themselves or being alone and spending that time with themselves. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it can be challenging.
And you don't want to live there, right? Like you don't want to never be around other
Mm-hmm.
people, right? It's about that balance of being able to be interacting with others, but then also carving out space and time where it's just you. I think is really important, especially
Yeah,
for me as a mom. That's super important because there's always someone who needs me, right?
yeah, for sure. Um, Now you're a storyteller, as you kind of define yourself a little bit. Um, what
Mm-hmm.
is your story and your experience with mental health?
That is a really profound question, Vermont. Like a long answer. So, um, I became interested in personal growth when I was about 15. There's all these things happening in my family of origin, and I was looking for answers. I was looking for ways to help my family. And so I attended these personal development workshops and I started kind of getting really interested. And I remember my first workshop, I was 15 and the minimum age was 16. And I actually had to like really convince the facilitator that like I was mature enough to handle it. And when I started going to these workshops, there was this whole other world that I'd never been exposed to, which was about like boundaries and self-care and like accountability and all of these different things that, you know, in the day of growing up in a family, like you don't really talk about that stuff, right? You just kind of get through, especially with like immigrant parents who are working hard, and it's like we don't have those conversations. And so starting to have those conversations in my teen years is how it all started. And that's where I learned about journaling, and that's where I learned about, you know, self-reflection. And then when I went to university, I studied psychology and sociology, and I found it so fascinating. And I remember there was this conundrum that I had because I really I really understood how groups have impact. So sociology and the psychology of groups. And then I also understood about that. So I kind of trained in like the individualistic cultures, but also the collectivist cultures and looking at the overlap there and how that affects mental health. Because in different cultural communities, there's different like norms, right? Of what is normal mental, like what is stable or steady mental health, what does that look like? And being someone who's from a different cultural background, well, that was important to me to kind of make sense of that. So that was kind of my exploration from an academic perspective. And then I did my master's and my PhD. Personal experience of mental health. You know, from when I was really young, people would call me very sensitive. I was sad a lot. Things would really get to me. I remember being about 7 or 8 years old and being at the wave pool, the you know, swimming pool where there's
Mm-hmm.
waves with cousins, and like they're all having fun, and I just felt so sad, and I couldn't understand why I was just always so sad. And you know, went to high school, through university, and finally just about maybe 3 years ago, I crashed and I had this really major depressive episode, to the point where I was, and I had got there close to there before, but I never really wanted to admit to myself that there was like a longer term issue. I thought it was like, situational based, like, oh, this is because I'm going through a breakup, or this is because, um, I failed a class. Like there was always some sort of external reason. A
Mhm.
few years ago when I really crashed, I kind of woke me up to, oh my goodness, like yes, I've been helping other people through their mental health challenges, and I need to get really honest about myself about what's going on for me. And so I reached out for support. I started working with a doctor to look at like the kid. I was always working with a therapist, but I kind of like increased my sessions with my therapist, and I actually got a new therapist at the time. And I think related in the things that are required to stay. And that lived experience, and that like that I don't know, in the olden days they might have called it like a nervous breakdown, right? That
Mhm.
nervous breakdown, it was an existential crisis for me, and it's made me so much more like, my eyes are much more open now when I'm working with clients who have depression and anxiety, because I'm not just talking about it, I've actually lived through kind of the worst that it's ever been. So that's I don't know if I've ever told you this story, Vermont, before, about my
No.
journey. But yeah, that's kind of my personal story around mental health. And before me, see, the thing that was happening in my family is I had a sibling who's like kind of caught up and tangled up in addiction, and so it was always kind of about him and his needs and like what's going on for him. So I never really considered that I might have something going on. Um, but I do. And so when that was no longer occupying me, I kind of learned what's really going on with me. And my son has like early signs and symptoms of anxiety, and so it's in our family system. And the more we can like normalize it, the more we can talk about it, the easier it is then for my kids to have tools, right? And not feel like there's something wrong, like fundamentally wrong with them as people. It's just something that we live with, and we work through it together.
Hmm. And that's kind of my idea with this podcast too, to be able to share our stories and how we handle it and how we live with it.
Mhm.
Um, so for yourself, I guess, how did you cope through all those years of feeling that way, and you're probably still coping, but maybe
Yeah.
sharing some strategies that helped you.
So what happened 3 years ago is I changed my diet significantly. So I think the way I have been coping, I was coping since I was a teenager, is through food. And so I had a really severe food addiction. I was obese for many, many years of my adult life. And when I stopped using food, that's when I really crashed, because I actually couldn't go to my normal coping mechanism. I would food, and then I would shopping was the other one, right? But then like there's only so much shopping you can do before racking up your credit cards, right? So I didn't have those like normal quote coping mechanisms. And so I would say the way I used to cope was quite unhealthy, through eating. Like that's what I would do. Now the way I cope, it's like I said, it's those basic things like journaling and going for a walk. One of the big things, and this might sound hokey, but it's really been profound for me, is breathing, like changing the way I breathe. I went to this training at the Center for Mind Body Medicine a couple of years ago, and they did like all these practices around breath and what they call soft belly breathing, which is basically just deep breathing, like abdominal breathing, right? And since my breathing has, like, I can calm myself down much more quickly, I can center myself much more quickly when I use those breathing techniques. Um, and taking breaks. So I'm a bit of an achiever, high achiever, overachiever, and I've pushed myself a lot throughout my life. And in the last few years after that breakdown, I've learned to stop and rest and not have such high standards for myself. I
Mhm.
don't have to be perfect. Everyone doesn't have to agree with me or like me. And that's hard because I've always been a people pleaser. But kind of coming to terms with those things, that I have to prioritize my health. Just today I had this like this disagreement with a family member about something, because I'm like, this is what I need for my mental health, and they were like not getting it, right?
Mhm.
And not he's going to get it, but I know what I need, and I know where I need to set my limits and my boundaries, and that's hard for me as somebody who likes to help. So that's kind of how I cope. Some of the different ways, different areas that I cope. Oh, one other thing, I have a friend who's incredible, who also lives with depression. And my sister also has depression. So talking to people who have that lived experience has made such a profound difference for me, because I've tried to talk, in the past I've talked to other people, and their advice, while well-meaning, can be really dismissive. And so talking to other people who understand and have lived it is a huge coping mechanism for me.
For sure. It's kind of like that understanding that both of you have, or that, you guys share together. Yeah. Um, so are there any, I guess, quotes or mantras or sayings that kind of help you through when you're having a tough time that you'd like to share?
So the one for me is one day at a time, right? One day at a time. Sometimes it's 1 hour at a time, right? Or I'll tell myself, just get through this thing, right? Just get through this conversation, or this assignment, or this client, whatever. Just get
Mhm.
through, and then trying not to think too far in the future. So one day at a time is one. Another one is this is I don't know if I should share this, but it's, there's always going to be haters, right? There's always going to be
Mm.
people who don't like, and that's been a real learning curve for me, is about that people pleasing. And so
Mhm.
it's always going to be haters, one day at a time. And then another one, again, it might sound cheesy, but it's, you can do this, right? So I'll actually look at myself in the mirror and be like, you can do this, right? On days that it's just, I wake up feeling down, you can do this.
Mhm.
So those are the ones, one day at a time. There'll always be haters, and you can do that.
Haters gonna hate
So
with
deep.
Taylor Swift. uh, and I guess, as a mental health professional, are there any
Mhm.
myths or assumptions about mental health, mental illness, that you want to kind of address or clarify or share?
Absolutely. And I think the big one is, when you think of, when we think of depression, there's a certain image that comes to mind, right? Somebody who's in bed, and they can't get out of bed, or they're really sad, or they're crying. And that's not what depression looked like for me, because I was still functioning. I was still able to kind of put on this mask and put on this show and keep going. And so, people didn't know what was happening within my the walls of my home, but out there in the world it looked like I was fine. And so I think that's the big myth that I want to bust, is that it's not always obvious that somebody needs help. And so, and to listen for clues, like, not, I wasn't somebody who, because I always had a hard time asking for help. So this, in this area of my life, was no different, right? And so that's one. The other thing is, like, people are doing it for attention. Oh, you're just trying to get attention. And it's like one of those things where it's like, well, if I nobody wants to feel that way, right? Nobody would choose to feel anxious or choose to be depressed. It's something that just happens, and it can feel so just you can feel so helpless. And so when people are trying to be helpful and saying things like, oh, just go for a walk, or you just need to get out of bed, or you just need to do this or that, it can actually feel really judgmental. And
Mhm.
so another myth is that, like, I guess nobody can really fix it. It has to come from the person themselves, and it's a brain thing. Like, it's actually a brain thing. It's not a character flaw or a personality issue. It's not because, like, I had a bad child. Well, I didn't have the greatest childhood, but even people who have had lovely, warm, supportive home environments can still experience mental health issues. So this trying to find a place to blame, like either we blame the person or we blame their family, or that's the thing I want to bust. That myth I want to
Mhm.
bust, is that it's nobody's fault, right? It's not
Mhm.
somebody's fault that I have depression, and it's a real thing, and you might not know. Unless you ask. And for those who live with mental illness, I think one of the things that can be really painful is that and this is in the research too, right? That 2 out of 3 people who tell that they have mental illness will lose a few significant people in their life. They'll just lose them. And so no wonder we don't want to talk about it. And
Mhm.
maybe that's changing as more awareness comes, but that's the myth of like, oh, you know, it's almost like, oh, I'll catch it, or something weird, like I don't want to be around, it's too much work or it's too hard. And
Mhm.
I think that's kind of a privilege that like people who don't experience mental illness to kind of become curious and informed about what mental illness is would be really helpful, because those who suffer often suffer in silence, and there's help available. We just have to seek it out. We just have to ask for it. But when there's the barrier, the additional barrier of, oh, but my family doesn't even believe in mental illness as a thing, or, you know, just toughen up, or then it makes it that much harder to ask and to admit that you have a problem.
Mhm.
So yeah, the big myth is that you don't always know. It's not always obvious that somebody has a mental illness,
Mhm.
specifically depression, anxiety. Some of the other mental illnesses may be more obvious, but these ones, not always.
Right. Yeah, and totally, especially for, or what I see is a lot of immigrant families who come with that like functioning depression where they're able to go to work, go to school and do their day to day, but yeah, they're suffering in silence and
And there
scared to
isn't language
share.
for it, right? There isn't,
Yeah.
like, my grandparents never talked about depression or anxiety. They don't have language. Our
Mhm.
actual language that we speak, there's no word for depression. There's the closest we can get is this word munjara, which kind of means like like a trapped feeling trapped. But that's the closest word. Like there's no word for anxiety. So
Wow.
it's not even there in the kind of the mindscape, right?
Mhm.
Of the culture, that this is a real thing. And so that makes it so much harder to talk about in family systems,
Yeah.
to convince people that no, actually something's going on here. And the funny thing
Wow.
is, like, for me and my family, it's like my mom has depression undiagnosed, my dad probably has undiagnosed depression, and so for them this is just life is just hard, life is just
Mhm.
sad, life is just overwhelming, that's just life. When I
Mhm.
started taking medication, I realized, like, oh, that doesn't have to be life. Like life could actually be quite beautiful and quite rich and quite steady, right? But
Mhm.
because we were all living with it, not calling it that, the messaging was, well, this is just life, just deal with it.
Mhm.
Life is hard, and people will let you down, and there's nothing to look forward to. So
Mhm.
oh, right.
And that makes just the quality of life so much lower if that's kind of your mindset, almost,
That's the
you know.
bar, right?
Yeah, like what's the point?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And then there's that
Yeah.
additional around, like, again, that, so because I'm from a family and myself, like really really steeped in our spiritual tradition and our faith, and so it's almost like, well, you know, you should be able to pray this away, this, you know, if you're strong in your belief, then you shouldn't be feeling, but that's a load of crap. Like, we know that, right? That people can be
Mhm.
very very connected to their spirituality and still be really suffering. So
Mhm.
you can't just put it away. And so that, again, that's some of the advice and the recommendations. People are trying to be helpful, but it's actually really painful, because I just felt so misunderstood all the time.
Yeah. Um, my final question is, what advice can you give the listeners who are struggling, um, or going through something similar?
So the advice that I got was, you're not alone in this, right? That
Mhm.
it might feel like you're alone because you might be the only one that in your circle who's experiencing this, but there's a huge community of people out there who understand and who will get you help and will help you figure out how to get help. So that would be my, like, to actually ask for help. And it might not be to your immediate family if that's not a comfortable or safe space. It might be, you know, through a support group. It might be through your family doctor. Like, there's lots of places that you can plug in. And so my advice would be, if you don't have to suffer in silence by yourself, reach out and ask. And it doesn't make you weak, and it doesn't make you, it actually makes you quite strong and courageous to say that I can't figure this out on my own. So that would be my advice. And the other piece is go to therapy. Oh my goodness, it's so so helpful, because these are people who are like actually professionally trained to support you through exactly what you're going through. And it's just, it's amazing. Like, I'm a therapist, and when I'm sitting there with a client, you know, it's almost like I have a different hat on. When I'm sitting with my own counselor, like, she's telling me things that I tell my own clients, but it's different when it's you, right? It's different. So even if you're somebody who's listening, who's like really successful in another area of your life, like say you're successful in your job, or say, you know, you really have a really healthy and wholesome family or whatever, it doesn't preclude you from having this going on. You know, it doesn't protect you per se. And so ask for help, ask for help. That would be my advice.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Saira. It was a pleasure talking to you today.
Thanks for having me.